in New England. Tucked away there up in the northeast section. It's kind of a very defined region. Do you ever think about that? Other parts of America are kind of indefinite in their borders. But we have fairly certain borders. It's Canada to the north. To the west are the hills, the Berkshires, the Green Mountains, the Hudson River, the Lake Champlain. And then down to the south, of course, is continuing the Hudson River. So we're kind of a distinct region. We're a region that is not rich in agricultural, our soil is poor. And so the first settlers who came here, those men and women who arrived, they came as farmers, but it didn't take them long to realize that farming wasn't going to work very well here. And so they turned to the sea. It would be from the sea that they would gain their living. It would be the sea that would be the barrier to enemies. It would be the sea that would be the avenue back to the mother country. To be seamen then, they began to look about shipbuilding. Why not? The soil might be poor, but we have lots of pine, lots of oak, and lots of rivers and indentations and bays. And so wherever there was firm ground, available timber, there shipbuilding could begin. It wasn't terribly complicated. These were men and women with carpentry skills. They knew how to hew wood. And so building vessels as simple as this became rather easy. And they did. All along our coast, places to build vessels. Men working in shipyards, sawing timber, along the Kennebec River, along the Mystic River, along the Charles River, along all of the rivers along the New England coast, these small vessels being built. And built for what? Built to harvest the real treasure of New England. And the real treasure was fish. 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 Codfish. Large codfish, which seemed to be unlimited in their numbers. It has taken us about 500 years to destroy this industry. We managed to do it. But back in the 16th and 17th century, they looked at these codfish as being completely unlimited. It was Bartholomew Gosnold who sailed into a body of water behind a spit of sand, who saw so many codfish that he said, this must be Cape Cod Bay. And so the codfish then becomes the heart, the very foundation of the New England economy. It is codfish that will draw us into international trade. It is codfish that will bring us into the West Indies. 1638, the British take the Barbados. They were rather late coming to the Caribbean. Others were there before. The Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, a little bit farther south. And when the English arrived there in the West Indies, they undertook the same business that had already been established there. Sugar, sugar, sugar. Sugar plantations. Sugar plantations with an insatiable demand for labor. And that labor would come from enslaved Africans. The land was so valuable to grow sugar, growing agricultural crops was not economical, so the planters needed food, cheap food for their slaves. And they found that cheap food from New Englanders, codfish, of which we had a bounty. And so codfish then, bacala, dried codfish, becomes the commodity that is traded down to the West Indies. Down here to the West Indies in schooners and other vessels built in New England. New England becomes a thriving part of an Atlantic world. It's not just the West Indies to which we are connected. We're connected across the Atlantic. Bostonians know more about what's going on in Paris and Marseille and Madrid than they know what's going on in Worcester. But of course, nothing was going on in Worcester. So we are an international people, engaged with our faces firmly set to the sea. With our faces set to the sea, we need to protect and guide ourselves. Very early on, the merchants of Boston created a general fund for two purposes. One, to build the Province sloop. There you see her in the foreground, a small armed vessel that was intended to protect our shores against the Spanish and the Portuguese, whoever the empire might be at war with. In the 18th century, once in a while, peace broke out, once in a while, but more often than not, the empire was at war with someone, and so were we. And there in the background, another building created by this general fund, Boston Light. Boston Light. First lit 1716, still lit today to guide mariners in and out of the harbor of Boston. Wartime often occurred, and in wartime, Bostonians, merchants, seafarers turned to war to make business, to make profits. They went a privateering. The privateers were people who in time of war would go to the royal governor and ask for a commission. It's kind of a hunting license. And that commission would permit these privateers to arm merchant vessels and to go out and attack the enemies of the king. They were not pirates. So often I hear people describe privateers as pirates. They were not. This was all quite legal. So these privateers now would go out and seek the enemies of the king. Truth of the matter is, it was a very, very dangerous business. Most failed, but we never remember failures, do we? History is written by the winners. And so we always remember the privateers that succeeded in finding that richly laden Spanish galleon. You ever notice that's all one word, richly laden Spanish galleon? Well, sometimes they did. As an example, this is the Bethel. She is a Boston privateer owned by the Higginson family. And the Bethel indeed did go out and find that richly laden Spanish galleon and gave the Higginson family a good lift there in the 18th century. And by the way, this is a typical marine painting. Okay? It's called a coming and going painting. It's the same ship. The Bethel, you see her coming and you see her going. This was the owner's tribute to his vessel. Much as they like to have portraits of their family, they also like to have portraits of their ships. So Boston then deeply engaged in this empire struggle in war at sea. And the port thrived. Here is Boston in about the year 1768, right at the cusp of the beginning of the American Revolution. She was a busy and prosperous port. Boston was the largest city outside the United Kingdom, outside Great Britain. She was larger at this time in population than New York or Philadelphia. You can see there in the center of this print, that juxtaposition, that pier coming out, that's Long Wharf, still there today. Long Wharf in the 18th century was about a mile, half a mile to a mile long. Today it's not that long at all, it's still there. Not that Long Wharf has gotten shorter, it's that Bostonians over the last 2 centuries have filled in the harbor and would move forward. But here you see that, Boston as she appeared in this great moment of prosperity on the eve of the American Revolution. And down on the wharfs, what might you see if you visited this town? This would be a normal scene. Here is a ship of His Majesty preparing to go to war. Who knows where it's going? Perhaps to attack the French up in Canada, perhaps down to Cartagena in Colombia, who knows? And you can see the soldiers of the king in the red, the sailors and the officers there in the blue, and this young boy listening probably to the lies being told by the drummer boy of the great excursions, the great adventures that they're going on. So a vibrant, prosperous community, so tied to the sea. In Boston, a large population of sailors. When you think about the 18th century, you think of most people being farmers in the rural areas, and that's true. 90%, maybe more than 90% of the population of Massachusetts, mid-18th century, were farmers. But then you have those who work for a living, the proletariat, I guess as we would call it. And sailors made up the largest group of workers in the entire, all of Massachusetts, probably in all of the empire. Men who worked for a living. And here they are. You have this kind of romantic image of the jolly Jack tar, happy in taverns, dancing, whatever. And that's the image that you see here, the jolly Jack tar. For a short life and a merry one, dancing on board the ships, having a grand time in the taverns. But that really wasn't the case at all. It wasn't a jolly life for the Jack tars, not a jolly life at all. The Jack tars lived a grueling, terrible life. Average age of a sailor in the 18th century, 18 or 19. You didn't stay to sea long. You either died or came ashore. And then you had the problem of His Majesty's Navy. Sailing vessels, sailing warships of the 18th century had a huge demand for manpower. If you want to know how many men it took to sail one of His Majesty's great ships, take the number of guns the ship has and multiply by 10. And that gives you the size of the crew. I know perhaps many of you have been aboard USS Constitution, Old Ironsides. She's not a Revolutionary War vessel. She was built after the Revolution. But she's a good example. To man USS Constitution took about 500 men. 500 men. And so the ships of His Majesty with 28 guns or 36, 64, 100 guns in some cases were taking crews of hundreds of men. About 25% of a crew in the average year deserted, to say nothing of those who died. So there was a constant turnover. How do you get men to serve in the Navy? Well, not many men are just going to turn up and volunteer. So the Royal Navy impressed men. Impressment was perfectly legal. Perfectly legal. The captain of the vessel, HMS Penelope, might tell the first lieutenant, "Lieutenant, I need 10 men. Go get me 10 men." The lieutenant would take a press gang with him. They'd go ashore. They'd go to the usual places where you might find unemployed seamen, you know, most likely local taverns and whorehouses. Then you go in and you ask them, "Do you wish to serve His Majesty?" And you might say no. You might say no. You're going anyway, but you might say no. You then say, well, they'll just put you in cuffs and take you. Common, common, common. And so these sailors then, in ports like Boston and elsewhere, were constantly subject to the wrath of His Majesty and His Majesty's Navy. They were people with grievances against the King and the Royal Navy all the time. And so they became the fodder, the makeup of so many of the riots in the seaports. When the American Revolution is emerging in Boston and elsewhere, you know the story about the riots against the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, etc. Those men rioting in the streets were often predominantly sailors. First, they were probably unemployed because of the measures of His Majesty, and secondly, they were naturally aggrieved against the King. And so they made up this population in the streets. As an example of that, this is a cartoon that appeared shortly after the Tea Party. There in the background to the left, you can see tea being dumped in the harbor. But in the foreground, you have this person who's being tarred and feathered. A rather painful thing, a very painful thing. He's probably a loyalist, okay? He's being tarred and feathered, and tea is being poured down his throat to indicate his abhorrence of tea. And there to the right, if you look, you can see a sailor. So on the left there, it looks like a gentleman in a red coat, but there on the right is a sailor. Again, depicting the role that sailors were playing in the violence that took place in the streets of Boston and elsewhere in opposition to the King. And then they closed the port of Boston after the Tea Act. The closing of the port of Boston threw thousands of seamen into unemployment. And so now they're just wandering the streets, ready to find a way to act out their grievances. The closing the port of Boston, and then the other measures that the King and Parliament will take, so often struck right at the maritime empire. April 19th, 1775, all of this violence, the resistance to the King and Parliament emerges in Concord and in Lexington. The war has begun. So now it's no longer protest. The American Revolution has begun. And what role now are these sailors going to be playing in the war that is now erupted against the King? On April 19th, first at Lexington, then at Concord, and then all the way back to Boston for about 20 miles, a long running fight between American militia and the soldiers of the King. When the British Army finally managed to find refuge in Boston, the Americans follow them, and within a few days, Boston is under siege. 20,000 American militia, all of New England, some from as far away as New York, some even coming up from Virginia now, laying siege to the British in Boston. Commanding the British, Sir William Howe, the general. Commanding the ships in the harbor, Admiral Samuel Graves. And so Boston now, this tiny little island really, it's almost an island. The only thing that connects Boston to the mainland is a thin strip of land right down there at the bottom. That's Boston Neck. The rest of Boston is all water. And so the British immediately realize that their only salvation is supply reinforcement by sea. The Americans, the New England militia has them surrounded in the land. So General Howe and Admiral Graves now must deal with the fact that they're surrounded, that the city is under siege. Boston in the center, before we filled it all in and created Logan Airport, etc., has out in the harbor nearly 20 small islands. These islands out in Boston Harbor had always been useful to the Bostonians and others. They were useful to graze animals. In the springtime, the Bostonians and other farmers for that matter would take their sheep or cattle and put them out on the island, out on Thompson's Island or Pettick's Island or George's Island, because on the islands they were safe from wolves. And they would leave them there for the spring, summer, into the fall, and in the winter they would bring them back. So the islands had lots of grazing animals. The British were hungry for provisions. They had thousands of troops in the city. They needed to find ways to provision them. And so the cattle and the sheep, etc., that were on these islands were very attractive targets for the British in Boston to go out and seize these islands. And so the British are looking carefully now, Admiral Graves and the general, about what they can do. As they're looking at Boston Harbor, down to the south, some action has already begun. John Lindsay, commander of His Majesty's sloop Falcon, is sailing in the waters of Rhode Island Sound, Nantucket Sound, and Buzzards Bay. Lindsay attacks Dartmouth, which is today New Bedford. He attacks Dartmouth, does considerable damage, and Dartmouth retaliates. So now we have, in May 11th, 1775, not even a month after Lexington and Concord, the first engagements on the water between the Royal Navy and some local New Englanders down there battling John Lindsay and the Falcon. Here in Boston, as the British begin to test themselves out on the islands, they find one island in particular that is of interest to them that has lots of grazing animals. It's a place called Grape Island. Grape Island is just off the shore of Weymouth, back to this part of the town of Weymouth. And so Grape Island becomes a target for the British now to seize. And we have the Grape Island Alarm. Sunday, May 21st, 1775. From this site, Weymouth militiamen repulsed an attempt by the British to secure supplies from Grape Island for General Howe's beleaguered army in Boston. So the action then is just not too far from where we are right now. Abigail Adams. John was in Congress at the time. Abigail Adams, who wrote to John, the letters between Abigail and John, about 1,100 of them, were so fortunate. He was away so much that they wrote. If he'd been home all the time, we wouldn't know so much. But she writes to John to tell him about Grape Island. It seems their expedition, meaning the British, was to Grape Island for Levitt's Hay. May say with truth all of Weymouth, Braintree, Hingham, who were able to bear arms, and hundreds from other towns within 20, 30, 40 miles of Weymouth showed up to drive the British off of Grape Island. So again, the Battle of Grape Island is engaged now in this oncoming sea adventure. Back in Boston, up near Chelsea Creek, which is just to the north end of the harbor, the British vessel Diana runs aground. General John Stark is sent out to burn Diana, and Diana is burned. General Stark, by the way, is the general from New Hampshire, who will later, just about a month later, distinguish himself at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So Boston Harbor, down here in Grape Island, down in Martha's Vineyard, the action is now taking place between the British and the Americans. And then far to the north, about 316 miles to the north up the coast, another piece of action takes place at a rather remote town, Machias, Maine, close to the Canada-Canadian border. There at Machias, Maine, there shows up a man named Ichabod Jones. Mr. Jones is a merchant. He's a loyalist from Boston. General Howe has sent Mr. Jones with 2 vessels up to Machias to get firewood. With the city under siege, Howe didn't have any firewood, so he sends Ichabod Jones up to Maine, to Machias, to get firewood. Well, by this time, the folks in Machias have just heard, things travel slowly in the 18th century, they've just heard something just happened in Lexington and Concord, and something's going on in Boston. But, even though they didn't know for certain, they already were members, they proudly members of the Sons of Liberty. And right in the middle of Machias, they had a liberty pole, a tall pole with a liberty cap on top. And so Mr. Jones shows up with 2 vessels, escorted by a Royal Navy schooner, the Margaretta. The Margaretta shows up with these 2 schooners here to Machias. Lovely little place, little dam there, sawmill. When the British show up, the Americans are, at first, not terribly resistant, but they're not terribly welcoming. The local leader of the Patriots, Sons of Liberty, is a man named Jeremiah O'Brien. And Jeremiah O'Brien rallies them to oppose the British, and before long, they seize Ichabod Jones's 2 sloops, and then they take the sloops and they attack the Margaretta. So the American sloop Unity and Margaretta, and they capture the Margaretta, June 12, 1775. It is the first Royal Navy vessel to fall victim to the Americans. And it's the first real, sort of small, but real naval battle of the American Revolution. And so the war at sea now is moving forward, while the siege of Boston continues. June 1775, after the battles at Lexington and Concord, depositions flow into Philadelphia, explaining to the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, which has just convened, explaining to them what has happened, the terrible thing that has happened. And the Massachusetts delegation asks the Continental Congress to adopt the Army at Boston. At this moment, the Army at Boston, the American Army, is made up of various militia units from the various states. And so now the Massachusetts delegation asks the Congress to adopt the Army. It is a momentous moment. The Congress votes to adopt the Army. It becomes the Continental Army. It needs a commander. Who will command this Yankee Army? There's only one person in the Second Continental Congress who arrives in uniform. He's sitting in the back, in the blue uniform of a Virginia militia colonel. Good-looking guy. He's about 6'2", built like a linebacker. And of course, you know the story. John Adams rises in the Congress, makes this speech about this wonderful person, all the adjectives, holding the name to the very last. The very last moment he says, you know, I give you George Washington. Immediately, Samuel Adams, his cousin, rises up and says, I second that. Washington is apparently embarrassed and goes out to the men's room. In the meantime, John Hancock, president of the Congress of Massachusetts, thought that Adams, of course, was talking about him. And when Adams says, George Washington, Hancock, but Washington is appointed commander-in-chief. On July the 3rd, 1775, he shows at Cambridge to take command of the Army. This is an image that never happened. we know he takes command July 3rd, but it's unlikely there's any ceremony, and it certainly wasn't like this. You've got to have a white horse lifting his hat, and men all lined up, spiffy looking. No, that didn't happen. But he did arrive July 3rd. He's now in command of the American Army, the Continental Army, surrounding the British in the town of Boston. Washington is not a naval genius. In fact, he can strike naval. I don't think he was a genius. Able commander. But he understands that the British depend upon their sea lanes in Boston to be supplied. What can we do about that? Colonel John Glover comes to visit him. Colonel Glover is from Marblehead. He's a fisherman, merchant. Glover visits Washington at Washington's headquarters. That is the headquarters there. The Longfellow Washington headquarters there in Cambridge. And he suggests to General Washington that a way to strike at the British is to get armed American vessels, you know, a la privateers of the old days, and strike at the British ships coming in. The British are so cocky, by the way, that their ships coming in to supply them are not armed. The Americans can't get at them. Washington listens to Glover, and he knows himself. He doesn't need to be persuaded. And so Washington charters the Hannah. It just so happens, by the way, just so happens, that the Hannah is owned by Colonel Glover. A little conflict of interest there. But the Hannah, September 5, 1775, is commissioned. She is recognized as the first vessel in the American Navy. She flies the Appeal to Heaven flag. Hannah goes out and is soon joined by 6 other vessels that Washington charters, and they have tremendous success. Because again, these British transports are arriving unescorted and unarmed. And they're able to take munitions, cannon, uniforms, all of the things that Washington has difficulty getting from the Continental Congress comes to him now thanks to the British. The little navy that he has, Washington's Navy, proves to be very, very successful. Very successful. So successful that on October 13th, 1775, the Congress resolves that a swift sailing vessel to carry 10 carriage guns and a proportional number of swivels with 80 men be fitted with all possible dispatch for a cruise of 3 months, and that the commander be instructed to cruise eastward for intercepting such transports as may be laden with warlike stores and other supplies for our enemies, and for such other purposes as the Congress shall direct. October 13th, 1775 is taken as the birthday of the American Navy. The American Navy celebrates October 13th, 1775 as the birthday of the Navy. And indeed it was. For now the Congress, not just Washington acting on his own there in Boston, but the Congress has now taken responsibility to the establishment of a Navy. You need a committee, of course, okay, to run things. That's how the Congress did things. And John Adams was absolutely central to that. Adams, of course, had practiced admiralty law here in Boston. He wasn't a seaman, to be sure, but he certainly knew the law of the sea. He knew it very, very well. And so Adams once remarked later in his life that his service on the Naval Committee was the pleasantest part of my labors for the 4 years I spent in Congress, from 1774 to 1778. And indeed, he was instrumental. One of the things that John Adams did was that he literally wrote the rules for the regulations of the Navy of the United Colonies. He wrote the first edition of the rules for the United States Navy. He drew from many sources which he was quite familiar with, and wrote the rules. And he was central, absolutely central now to the efforts of the Continental Congress to create a Navy. Surrounded now by Americans on land, difficulty of getting supplies in by sea, and with Boston being of really very little strategic value, on March 17, 1776, the British evacuated Boston and left first for Nova Scotia, and then later, of course, in the summer, they'll arrive down in New York. Before they left, as a parting gift to Boston, they blew up the Boston Light. The lighthouse that is out there today was constructed in 1780 after the war. So the original lighthouse, just as their hail and farewell to Bostonians, just blew it up. So now Boston is secure. And it will be more or less secure as a port for the rest of the Revolution. The Revolution begins in Boston, but by 1776, late 76, the Revolution has moved to other parts of America. Well, now we need to move forward. In December 13th, General Washington, a letter from Washington urging the Congress to do more. Thus far, with Washington, he had chartered vessels. That is, he had rented them. And now what the Congress wants to do is build a Navy. Build a real Navy. And so in December, rather full of themselves, by the way, when you think about this, this was an incredible goal. It was a preposterous goal. They could never have done this. But nonetheless, it is a revolution. Congress is filled with optimists. And so the Congress resolves that 5 ships of 32 guns, 5 of 28, 3 of 24, making about 13. 13 is the magic number, by the way. Okay, 13 ships now will be built. The Congress calls them to be built. And we're going to build them in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland. Notice, by the way, some things never change. 13 ships, 1 for each of us. And we're going to build them in various locations so that everybody sort of gets a piece of the action. And by the way, the construction of these ships, most of them are never finished, and they all cost more than the original estimates. So again, some things don't change. But here it is, the goal to build 13 frigates to challenge His Majesty's Navy. It is, again, a preposterous goal, but nonetheless, in the aura, in the optimism, in the enthusiasm of the Revolution, they were trying to do it. And they do build some. These vessels that are now going to be built, some built in America, are the largest vessels ever built in America. Nothing of this scale has ever been built. All the thousands of vessels that were built in the 17th and the 18th century, none of them were of the size of these frigates. In fact, think about it for a moment. Ships are the largest thing that moves that we make. Okay? Even today, ships are the largest thing we make that move. And that was true here. Very complicated, very expensive machines to build. Here you see the Randolph preparing to be launched. It was always a great day, by the way, a launching day. The vessel was there on the ways. You see down below the carpenters with their mallets upraised. They're about to knock the blocks out so that when they knock the blocks out, the vessel will slide gracefully into the water as she's christened with her name. Doesn't always work well, by the way. USS Constitution was launched 3 times. First time, the builder called out for the blocks to be knocked out. They knocked the blocks out. She didn't move. Stuck like a whale, beached whale. They pushed, they shoved, they swore. Nothing went. Second time, same problem. Third time, they kind of did it in secret. They didn't want to be embarrassed. And then she went into the water. But launching these vessels, again, huge, huge monsters. But here we see one ready to go into the water in the full euphoria. Randolph, the frigate, is going. And, of course, we need a Navy. We need men, and the Congress, in its usual way, prescribed uniforms. These are the uniforms that were prescribed. Whether or not the officers and men ever really wore them seems somewhat unlikely, frankly. But nonetheless, didn't stop. So now we have ships, we have an officer corps, we have uniforms, and we need seamen. The encouragement of seamen. How are we going to get these seamen? How are we going to pay them? Come, this is patriotic now. Great encouragement for seamen. And these broadsides would show up everywhere, in taverns, everywhere, encouraging men. And men would sign up. There's a large surplus population of seamen here in New England, okay? They're not employed in the merchant service, not during the war, so they're available for service. But there are other opportunities. If you join the Continental Navy, you'll be paid a regular wage. If you become a privateer, you have a chance of kind of a profit-sharing enterprise. As when privateers go out, these private vessels, whatever they capture is theirs. Belongs to the privateer. And it will be shared with the owner, the captain, the crew. So if you're a successful privateer, you stand to make a lot of money. The Continental sailors, no, they're just going to get their wages. And so privateersmen are able then to attract seamen in far greater numbers than the Continental Navy. What does the Continental Navy do to help fill its ships? Impressment. Impressment. The British weren't the only ones who did it. The Continental Navy also impressed American seamen to serve on American ships. But privateers are a big competition to recruiting, a huge competition to recruiting. Some of these privateers are rather well known. This is the Rattlesnake, love that name, the Rattlesnake, and she was from Plymouth, Massachusetts, one of the most successful of the privateers. Jonathan Harrington sailed too. Harrington was from Gloucester, Massachusetts. He was a fisherman, merchant sailor. Came the war, he became a privateersman. He too was successful. But again, this gives a gloss to it that is really not accurate, because these privateers were often not successful. Remember, these privateersmen are relatively small vessels. They don't go out to fight. Privateersmen are not looking for a fight. They're looking to find weak victims that they can capture. Sometimes they make serious mistakes and lose the battle. How many did we have? Well, here's kind of a lowdown here on what the competition is. Royal Navy, during the American Revolution, about 1,000 ships, okay, of all kinds. It's the biggest, most powerful, best in the entire world. New England privateers, 910. 910 privateers. Now, careful here, because of those 910, some are single-masted sloops and small. Some might even be rowboats for that matter. Okay? So that 910 is a big number, but it kind of tells you how many men were employed in privateering. A lot. And then there's the Continental Navy, about 20 ships. That's a good day, by the way, about 20 ships. And so the Royal Navy, the New England privateers, the scale here is important to keep in mind in terms of the effect on the war. But the Continental Navy now did exist, and before we could build enough ships, we chartered some more vessels in early 1777. They were put under the command, the newly established Continental Fleet, of this man, Isaac Hopkins. Mr. Hopkins is from Providence, Rhode Island. Notice that most of these captains are New Englanders. And Isaac Hopkins is given command of a fleet and told to sail south. He's given command of the Andrea Doria, which is his flagship. Andrea Doria, by the way, in today's world, kind of an unfortunate name. Andrea Doria was at the time, today, a very famous Genoese admiral of the 15th century. So Andrea Doria was a great hero, fighting for the freedom of Genoa. Today, I don't think you'd be likely to name your vessel Andrea Doria. But here she is, sailing south now, Commodore Hopkins in command. Where are they going? They're going to the Bahamas. They're going to Nassau. Because they know that the British fort at Nassau has a lot of munitions, which Washington needs, and it was not well defended. And so Hopkins and his fleet head for the Bahamas, for Nassau. There they arrive, and for the first time in American history, the Marines storm ashore. These are Marines landing at Nassau. There was no resistance. Hopkins' fleet in the distance. Hopkins manages to capture the cannon, the munitions, what have you, and they return back to Rhode Island. It's their first and last visit to the Bahamas. When you think about it, what a shame. We should have stayed. It might be an interesting 51st state, don't you think? Close in any case. But Hopkins' fleet managed to accomplish something that is very important, to bring back these munitions, and it's a victory. It gives glory to the Continental Navy. Other vessels now begin to come into service. The Hancock and the Boston, both here. The Hancock here, defeating one of His Majesty's vessels, the Spitfire. And they have certain victories that some of the American frigates have particular one-on-one victories against the British. They do annoy the British, but they're more pesky than powerful. But nonetheless, these American Continental ships do a good service and do bring some fame and glory. One of the greatest achievements of the Continental Navy during the war came under the command of this person, Abraham Whipple. Whipple, again, from Providence, Rhode Island. Whipple is ordered to sail in search of the Jamaica fleet. Every year, on a regular basis, a fleet, 50, 60 vessels, large fleet of merchant ships, escorted by His Majesty's gunships, sailed from Jamaica home. Now, think about the geography here and the currents. The route from Jamaica back to England, in fact, follows a northerly route, because these vessels sail out of the Caribbean, pick up the Gulf Stream. Gulf Stream carries them north, and then when they get roughly off the coast of New York, somewhere around that area, they begin to angle east. That is the route home from the West Indies. It's well known, well known. And so Whipple is told to go and hang out, wait for the Jamaica fleet. He finds it. It is the richest capture of the entire revolution. Whipple himself becomes an immensely rich man. They take about 7 or 8 of these very, very heavily laden vessels, bring them into Boston, and Whipple and the men of his fleet do well. Side note here, Abraham Whipple. I hope you've had a chance to read Mr. McCullough's book, Pioneers. Abraham Whipple, after the war, goes back to Rhode Island as a farmer. Farming in Rhode Island is not so great either. So what does he do? Leaves Rhode Island, 1788, heads west. Where does he go? Marietta, Ohio. He's one of the early settlers of Marietta, Ohio. In fact, when Whipple gets to Marietta, Ohio, seaman that he is, he builds a ship. And the ship that he builds sails down the river and is the first vessel reaching New Orleans, is the first vessel built in Marietta. This is Abraham Whipple's monument, the Mound Cemetery in Marietta. So this Commodore, this very successful Commodore of the Continental Navy, takes his money and heads west and settles and dies in Marietta, Ohio. The problem that Massachusetts faces is not that Boston is vulnerable necessarily, it's pretty well defended, but it's the British coming down out of Canada. The British who are seizing now the area around Penobscot Bay. Penobscot Bay is about 250, 300 miles north of where we are. It's at the mouth of the Penobscot River, which goes up to Bangor. There, the British seized an area called Bagaduce. Today, we recognize as Castine, Maine. Lovely little town. Today, in fact, it's the home of the Maine Maritime Academy. The British seized Castine, Maine, because they want to use it as a base from which to attack the New England coast. The news that the British have taken Castine panics Boston, because it means now that having spent 3 years not being troubled by the British, now Boston faces this threat from Penobscot Bay, from the British. And so immediately the Bostonians react, Massachusetts reacts, the Continental Navy reacts, we must drive the British out of Castine. The Americans sailed to Castine under the command of a man named Douglas Saltonstall, a Connecticut Saltonstall, not a Massachusetts Saltonstall. Saltonstall commands the Navy, and a man named Solomon Lovell, Brigadier General Solomon Lovell, commands the military. Mr. Lovell is from Abington, Massachusetts, but he really lives in Weymouth. And so these two men now are in joint command. They arrive at Castine, and then spend the next 21 days arguing about who is going to attack first. Lovell says, Saltonstall, send your ships in. Saltonstall says, Lovell, send your men in. In fact, Saltonstall says to Lovell, I'm not sending my ships into that damn hole. And so they fight. 21 days they're in discussion. And then on day 21, the British show up. They had been aware, of course, of the Americans. Admiral Collier shows up with a rather sizable squadron, sails up into Penobscot Bay, devastates, decimates the Americans. Not a ship is left. Okay? The Americans are running to escape through the forest, trying to get away from the British who are chasing them down now. It is a colossal disaster. Penobscot expedition is the worst naval disaster in American history up until Pearl Harbor. Number of ships and men lost, all because these men couldn't get along. In the American Army, there is the Colonel of Artillery, Paul Revere. He's present for this. Paul Revere is court-martialed for cowardice. He asks for the court-martial. That's how bad things got. Everybody was pointing fingers at everyone else, and so Revere was court-martialed for cowardice. He is acquitted, but it sort of ends his military career in the Continental Army. As for Solomon Lovell, he's buried not far from us in the North Weymouth Cemetery. It's interesting, if you read the inscription, there's no mention of Penobscot. But there he is, Solomon Lovell, a great naval disaster. The Continental Navy now is falling into disrepute. They are failing. And then comes sort of the final note. You remember the Battle of Saratoga, 1777? Great American victory. It's a victory that persuades the French that maybe we can win, and that they ought to join us. So, February 6, 1778, a treaty of alliance, amity, and commerce is signed between the fledgling United States and France. The entrance of France into the war really makes the Continental Navy superfluous. The French are going to now send their fleets, their ships, which are a match to the Royal Navy. Large ships of the line, great numbers of them. And so the Continental Navy, not having really distinguished itself so far, is thrust further into the background as the French emerge and come to our aid. The arrival of the French is a great moment. The French fleet comes here to Boston, 1778. Boston is not a Francophile place, you know. We'd spent the last 100 years fighting them, the French and Indians, and it took a little bit to get and they were Catholic too, that was a problem. It took a bit of a problem, and in 1778, September 5th, 1778, there was a riot in Boston against the French, against their own allies, and in that riot, the Chevalier Saint-Sever was killed, died, and was buried. John Hancock was beside himself about this. Imagine what's doing for Franco-American relations. This is not good. And so the legislature passes a bill appropriating money to build a monument to the Chevalier. That's since 1778. Well, it never got built. It never got built. It never got built. I don't know what happened to the money, but it never got built. Until, of course, 1917. We're back with the French. The mayor of Boston, James Michael Curran, decides, maybe we better build a monument. And so in 1917, the monument was built, and you've probably seen it. You should stop by. It's right next to the air vent for the subway. It's just in front of King's Chapel. It's another simple granite monument to the Chevalier Saint-Sever, who was killed in the battle, or killed in the riot, in an attempt to reconcile with the French. Also, of course, the French were here in great numbers, 1778 through 1781. And many of the soldiers, sailors died from a variety of reasons. And there's a cemetery, Paul Revere Park, in the town of Hull, Massachusetts. Out there, just, again, not too far from where we are now, has a French cemetery in memory of the French military who died in Hull. So the assistance of the French, instrumental, vital to the success of the American Revolution, and had a particular resonance here in Boston, particularly with the Navy. The most important role that the French and the Navy played in the Revolution comes September 5th, 1781. You know the story. General Cornwallis, having failed to subdue the South, marches north, takes up his fortifications at a rather vulnerable place. It's called Yorktown. He is there with his back to the sea. He begs General Clinton in New York to do one of two things: send reinforcements or get me the hell out of here, one or the other. Clinton dispatches a Navy fleet to defeat, by this time, the French and the Americans have gathered around Yorktown. The British fleet comes down, and then September 5th, 1781, the British and French fleets meet at the Battle of the Capes. There at the Battle of the Capes, there's no decisive winner, but the British are turned back. The retreat of the British fleet marks the end for Lord Cornwallis. It means there will be no reinforcements, there will be no evacuation. One of the most important naval battles, certain in history. And the French victory, or the French turning the British back, marks the end of General Cornwallis. So in a very real way, the American Revolution is very much a naval effort, but the effort here by the French at the Battle of the Capes. The American Continental Navy continues on in this kind of somewhat preposterous way. We decide that since we tried to build frigates, but that didn't work so well, so why don't we build a ship of the line that is 64 guns? Now that's a big, big job, but we do it. And this is the launching of the ship of the line America in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She's built in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and launched. But she only serves about 1, maybe 2 days in the American Navy. In 1779, the French ship of the line, Magnifique, beautiful vessel, coming into Boston Harbor. The pilot, the Boston pilot, made a mistake. Magnifique is still somewhere off Lovell's Island. Hit the island and sunk. We're so embarrassed that our pilot did that when America was launched, we gave it to the French. Now that distressed the man living in this house. His name was John Paul Jones. Jones had been sent to Portsmouth, New Hampshire to take command of America. And so for a year he had lived in Portsmouth in this house, the John Paul Jones house, waiting to take command of America. Of course, America was turned over to the French. That is the end of John Paul Jones's career in the American Navy. Jones, as you probably know, goes on to serve the Russians. He becomes an admiral in the Russian Black Sea Fleet and goes on to other adventures as well. And so the American Navy, the Continental Navy, what did it in fact accomplish in pursuit of independence? Well, certainly one of the things that it did is this very famous painting by Edwin Moran called the First Salute. February 14, 1778, this is when the Ranger, another vessel built in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, when the Ranger enters Quiberon Bay and is saluted by the French Navy. It is the first time that the American flag is saluted by a foreign nation. And so the American Navy, Ranger, and other vessels too that sailed into European waters established a presence, an international presence of these rebelling colonies. The vessels in European waters also, and in American waters too, distracted the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy could have done a much better job had it not had the task of constantly patrolling against, seeking out American privateers and the Continental Navy. So it did, while neither the Continental Navy nor the privateers had any great, wonderful victories, they did manage to distract the British from other things that they might have been doing. The Continental Navy also transported goods, money, and diplomats. This is John Adams, writing from not far where we are right now. Captain Samuel Tucker, commander of the frigate, Tucker by the way is from Marblehead. Captain Samuel Tucker, commander of the frigate Boston, met me at Mr. Norton Quincy's, where we dined, and after dinner I sent my baggage and walked myself with Captain Tucker, Mr. Griffin, a midshipman, and my eldest son, John Quincy Adams, between 10 and 11 years of age. I always wondered, he didn't know exactly how many was. Down to the Moon Head, where lay the Boston's barge. The wind was very high and the sea very rough, but by means of a quantity of hay in the bottom of the boat and good watch coats with which we were covered, we arrived on board the Boston about 5 o'clock, tolerably warm and dry. And Samuel Tucker and Boston carried Mr. Adams and other diplomats too, other American diplomats, safely to Europe. So they provided that element of communication, of recognition by foreign powers. It's also true that many of the captains that served in the Continental Navy would go on to illustrious careers in the American Navy, Federal Navy, which would be established under George Washington. Of the 6 captains of the first 6 frigates in the United States Navy, 5 of them were in fact veterans of the Continental Navy. Silas Talbot, Thomas Truxton, John Barry, Samuel Nicholson, and Richard Dale. So 5 of the original 6 captains that had served in the Continental Navy now served in the birth of the new Federal Navy. So the Continental Navy then, and these captains truly were the ancestors and the progenitors of the United States Navy, whose October 13th, 1775 birthday is very much part of the American Revolution. Here endeth the lesson.